My bird of paradise, sweet bird of paradise. Episode 8 of Planet Earth is called Jungles, and as you'd expect, it's about the tropical rainforests. So this episode opens up in Papua New Guinea, where we see birds of paradise. So we saw birds of paradise in the first episode, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. But we see a bit more of them. We see a few different species. Birds of paradise generally look quite cool, and their displays are always quite unique. I feel like every time I see them, though I'm never that excited to see them, I'm always entertained by what they're doing. So it's always cool to see them. And then we move away from animal life and we start talking about plants. So we talk about when a tree falls in the rainforest, which they say is quite sad. I feel like this is the only time Attenborough ever says that something's sad in this series, despite the fact that we see quite a lot of horrific stuff. I mean, we did just see an elephant get killed by lions in the last episode, so priorities there. But we talk about how when a tree falls, that space has got to be filled by something else. And we see all these plants just vying for dominance. We see a lot of different types of plants basically trying to compete for the light. And ultimately, most of them will ultimately die out. And ultimately, it's the ones that have a slower growth rate, like the hardwoods, that make it. And they're the ones that are going to last the longest. This is a sequence that's been done a few different times by a few different series. Green Planet probably did it the best. But it's still a really good sequence. And again, I think anytime we see plants in the rainforest just vying for dominance, it's always cool. It always reminds you that despite the fact that plants are almost objects to us, just because they have a much slower growth rate, doesn't mean that they don't have the same struggles that we as animals do. I think that's pretty cool. I think to remind you of. This episode does focus quite well on the plants and other organisms that might not be plants that we'll discuss in a bit, but I think it's good to show that it's not all about the animals. This is ultimately planet Earth, and we're not the only types of organisms that live here, so it's quite good to talk about that. Then we talk about fig trees. Fig trees are important because they're the only type of tree that basically produces food all year round. We go to the Amazon, we see how various birds and monkey species use them. We see capuchins, we see squirrel monkeys, howler monkeys, you name it, they're all there, and they're all eating figs. And it's quite cool, you see how the kind of hierarchy between the different species forms. That's quite good as well. And we briefly look at Saimang. Ambra does imply that they're monkeys at a point. They're not, they're obviously apes. But still, they're good to see. And that kind of leads us into the next section, which is about sound. How sound is so important in the rainforest. So because most of the rainforest is dark, unless you're living in the tops of the canopy, you're generally living in darkness most of the time. So sometimes sight isn't always as important as sound. And we basically hear various sounds of the rainforest, whether they be cicadas or birds or orangutans. You could just imagine sitting in the rainforest and just listening to all these amazing sounds. Would be quite cool. And then from there we talk about frogs. So frogs are exceptionally vocal, and we see that during the breeding season various frogs are just calling over each other. We talk about how various species of frog can only hear the calls of their own species, which is quite interesting. I didn't know that. And then we touch on frog mating. So frog mating is pretty chaotic. And then we talk about how rainforests make their own climate. Obviously the rainforests are fairly wet, hence the name. But most of the rain actually comes from the trees themselves. They absorb all this water, but they can't use all of it, so they basically expel it all as mist. And we see all these clouds forming over the rainforest. I mean, the cloud forests as well, which aren't really touched on here, are quite an iconic habitat, and that's basically formed by the trees themselves. So that's quite good to talk about. Again, the geography is also important. I like how Planet Earth focuses on that. My bird of paradise, sweet bird of paradise. And then we talk about the other great organism that inhabits the rainforests, and that's fungi. So we spend quite a lot of time on fungi, and I think this is the series that put fungi on the map for a lot of people. It's very memorable. So the fungi, we just see fungi just flourishing in the rainforest. They do look a bit minging. I do find fungi quite disgusting, personally. I don't like it. I don't know why. Every time I see mushrooms knocking about or toadstools, I'm always a bit like, ooh. It gives you good insight into how important fungi are. I mean, they obviously are the decomposers. They're the ones that get rid of all the waste. But the most memorable part of the fungus sequence is cordyceps. So cordyceps is pretty famous now. The Last of Us came out last year and it obviously dealt with that quite heavily. Cordyceps was put on the map by this series. This is probably one of the most memorable, if not the most memorable sequence from the series, I think. Basically, we see ants in the rainforest, and they're acting a bit weird. They're not doing too well. One of the ants basically climbs this tree for no reason and bites into it with its mandibles. And then we see this fungal structure emerge from its head and grow. This is the cordyceps body, basically. And when it reaches its full size, it will then burst, and we'll see all these little spores travel through the rainforest and will basically infect any ants that are in the vicinity. We see ants frantically removing other ants from the area, and you can see why. This obviously would be deadly. I think after having watched The Last of Us, you see how devastating this can be. And then we talk about how various insects are infected by it. It's not just ants. Various different species are infected by cordyceps, and it's very specific to one species. It really is pretty horrific. It's quite disturbing, but it's also really interesting. It's the sort of thing you'd see in a science fiction film, like Ambra says. Then we look at colugos briefly. I mean, they're a weird animal. We don't see them very often. I don't think we've seen them at all outside of this series. We see pitcher plants and how a lot of animals fall into them, specifically insects. We see these little crab spiders that basically live in the pitcher plants and will dive to catch their food, whether they be ants or mosquito larvae, and they can actually go right under the water to get them. That's quite cool as well. Again, I like how this episode focuses quite a lot on plants and insects. It's not all about the big animals. We saw a lot of big animals in the last episode, so we didn't need another episode focusing mostly on large mammals. So I think it was good to focus on insects and plants because they're also there too, planet Earth. It's not all about the big animals, it's about everything that lives on planet Earth. And this episode does that very well, I think. However, having just said that, we then talk about elephants. So we see forest elephants in the Congo, and it's pretty cool. We see them in these big clearings, how they meet up and everything. We spend quite a lot of time there just focusing on them. I feel like we've seen forest elephants a bit after this. Yeah, so I feel like the fact that we spend a lot of time here is because this was the first time we saw them, maybe. I don't know. But it's quite cool. We see them just socialising, fighting, playing, eating clay to, get rid of the toxins in the leaves. That's all really good. Again, it's quite a memorable sequence. They live in smaller groups because they can't really live in big groups in the forest. So these clearings are quite essential for them. A lot of them don't see each other outside of these clearings, which is quite good. And they obviously have to go their separate ways when they go back to the forest. It's a really good sequence. And then we see the chimpanzees. So the chimpanzees is one of the more memorable sequences, I think, from the series. So I did say in my mammals review that I think that at a point I was getting a bit fed up with chimpanzee sequences. They do appear a lot, and a lot of the time they're doing the same thing, or the same kind of thing. This is an exception to that. I do think this is a really good sequence. So basically see these groups of chimpanzees, they've got big territories. This part of Uganda, there's a lot of fig trees, kind of going full circle to where we started. And we talk about how that supports quite a large population of chimpanzees. So there's a lot of chimpanzees, a lot of groups of chimpanzees, and they're kind of competing for the food sources. And we see what happens when two groups come together. One group specifically kind of going after another. One group's just in the trees, just enjoying their figs when they're set upon by this massive group of chimps. It's quite a horrific sequence. We talk about one female basically gets brutally attacked by four males. I feel like that implies something that maybe isn't great. And then we talk about how one of the chimps doesn't get away and is eaten by the others. So this isn't something I expected to see. I've said in previous videos that I feel like we've seen a lot of chimp hunts to the point where I don't think they have the same effect. This is different because it's not really a hunt. They're not hunting monkeys. They're basically attacking another group of chimps and then eating one of them. It's just pretty dark. It's a pretty grim sequence. They do talk about how grisly it is. It's not something you expect to see, especially with an animal that is so close to us. They don't really get an explanation as to why they do it. It may just be because it's extra protein. Meat seems to be quite an important part of certain chimp societies. So, it makes sense. But yeah, it's a pretty grim sequence, and that's kind of how we end the episode. We end the episode talking about how, rainforests, they're very specialised. A lot of specialised animals live there, and, they're pretty delicate, well-balanced ecosystems. But in that, they're very easily destroyed by the other great ape, which is us. So it's again one of the very few times we get an environmental message in the series, but because it's one of the only ones in the series, it feels more effective, I think. So I think that's really good. After that, we see the diaries. So the diaries is basically the guys filming the Birds of Paradise, and it's quite good. It's very funny. I'll be honest, more than anything, it's hilarious. The guy in the hide spending like well over 100 hours trying to film them was great, especially when the song, that Bird of Paradise song, keeps playing. That was hilarious. It was really funny. The bit where the bridge got stolen, they had to build the bridge. And this man who looked like he might have been blind was walking with his pig over it to test it. Like the last episode, I felt like I was on a journey with that diary sequence. This one, I just felt like I was laughing most of the time. It was pretty funny. So yeah, I really liked it. Overall, this episode is very good. It's a very good episode. I think there's a lot to like here. The stuff with the cordyceps is probably the highlight, but the chimpanzees are great. The elephants I really like. The pitcher plants, the frogs. Everything, basically. There isn't a weak point in this episode. If I had to pick a weak point, I would really struggle more so than other episodes. I think this is probably one of the most, if not the most consistent episode in the series. It's pretty great. So what were your highlights? Let me know in the comments below. So yes, I will be doing the Shallow Seas episode next, so look forward to that. And as ever, feel free to like, comment and or subscribe. Or don't, it's up to you. I don't really mind. I appreciate it if you do, but if you don't, then fair enough. But yeah, I will see you next week, and goodbye. My bird of paradise, sweet bird of paradise.